Hello, Econ 151 students. This is the second part of our Lesson 1 review lesson. This is going to cover the materials in Chapter 3. So the first part dealt with Chapter 1, and now we're going to skip over to Chapter 3. This is a quick review of the concepts of demand and supply and some government controls in the markets. For a lot of you, this will be a review of macroeconomics. For some of you, this might be the first time you are coming across these things. Either way, you should have what you need after the end of this lecture. So we'll start with the concept of demand and define demand. And for our economics education, we define demand really specifically as the different quantities of goods that consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices. So when we talk about demand, we're not talking about just something that people want. We actually give it a specific definition so that it can be measured. So it has to be willing and able to purchase something. So the example I give here of Bill Gates, he might have the money to buy a Ferrari, but if he's not willing to, then he has no, what we would call economic demand for one. The law of demand is this idea that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And this is an important thing to understand. This inverse relationship can be explained in a couple of different ways. There are three effects that explain this law of demand, this inverse relationship. Inverse relationship, if you remember back to the math review, an inverse relationship is mathematically what we call a negative relationship. As one thing goes up, the other one goes down. So a positive times a negative is always a negative. And we could say it in reverse, as one goes down, the other one goes up. And again, a negative times a positive is a negative. So when we're talking about expressing this graphically, it would be mathematically a negative slope to the line. Just to kind of keep that in mind. So the law of demand then is this inverse relationship between price and quantity. So why is that the case? Why is it that as prices go up, we purchase less of something, and as prices go down, we purchase more of something? So we have three effects, essentially, that will explain this. The first one is called the substitution effect. These all, to some extent, explain the law of demand. No one of these is a perfect explanation, but between the three explanations, you get a pretty clear picture of the law of demand. So the substitution effect says that if the price for something goes up, consumers buy less of that product and more of another substitute product. So you see the example here of Coke versus Pepsi. And we can understand this because we can say, well, if the price of Coke goes up, people will buy less of it, so the quantity demanded will decrease as we're purchasing the less expensive replacement, the substitute product. So that is a partial explanation for the law of demand. Part of it can be explained by the fact that as the price of one thing goes up, assuming there are adequate substitutes, demand for the substitute will go up and the quantity demanded of the original product will decrease. The second effect, and again, these are just explanations for why we have this inverse relationship. The second effect is called the income effect. And this is when the price goes down for a product, the purchasing power for a consumer increases. And so think about this. If something gets cheaper, you become very happy about that, and you think, ooh, I have more money. And as a result, I'm probably going to buy more of that product with that additional money. The same can be said in reverse. If the price goes up for a product, the purchasing power decreases, and we're going to purchase less of it. That's just human nature. So that's, again, a partial explanation. The third explanation that may explain the law of demand or overlap with the other two in some way is called the law of diminishing marginal utility. And utility is an important word to understand in economics. It's a synonym for satisfaction. And we buy goods because they give us satisfaction. So what we're saying when we talk about the law of diminishing marginal utility is that as you purchase more of a good, that's that marginal, that word again, marginal means additional. So as we purchase more of a good, we get less and less satisfaction from each additional unit eventually. And it doesn't mean that right away that happens, but eventually the law of diminishing marginal utility will set in. And because of this, as we buy more of a good, we're willing to pay less for additional units because we get less satisfaction from them. And we'll talk more about the law of diminishing marginal utility in this course, although if you took microeconomics recently, I would imagine you spent some time talking about that with respect to the costs of a firm and the idea that their production gives them diminishing marginal satisfaction or production. So you might be familiar with the concept, but again, this is an explanation for that inverse relationship. So as price goes up, we're willing to pay less, or purchase fewer units, I should say, at that increased price. And as price goes down, we're willing to purchase more units at that lower price. The demand curve itself is a graphical representation of this law of demand, the inverse relationship. One goes up, the other one goes down. So it's a downward sloping line that shows that inverse relationship between price and quantity. Price is always measured on the y-axis, that vertical axis. Quantity is always measured on the horizontal axis, or what we call the x-axis. And that's a nice, simple, consistent concept in economics. That won't change on you, so you can always be comfortable understanding that price goes on the y and quantity on the x. And when we're reading a demand curve, we hold all outside factors, and by outside I mean external to price and quantity. We hold all other factors, such as income, we hold them constant when we're looking at this demand curve. And this expression of ceteris paribus is what we use to mean all other things being equal. Because we understand that lots of things influence our willingness and ability to buy something. But because we're examining just the relationship between price and quantity, we want to eliminate all those distractions and look only at that relationship when we're contemplating demand. So keep that in mind. We hold all outside factors constant as we're looking at the demand curve. Now, there will come a time when we drop that assumption, that ceteris paribus assumption, and we will have a change in the demand curve. But at this point, while we're just examining the relationship between price and quantity, we hold everything else constant. So let's look at a demand curve. Here it is. This is for cereal, and I'm being very general here in the market for cereal. And we have some information that's been gathered probably through some sort of market research. Of course, I've made it up for this. And these are our prices. And you can see there's that inverse relationship. As the price of cereal goes down, the quantity that people are willing and able to buy is increasing. And the reverse is true. As the price goes up, the quantity demanded decreases. So if we plot those points, remember that x and y. So y is our vertical axis, x is our horizontal axis. If we plot those points, and this is my x, oops, go back, this is my x and this is my y, then I can simply go, here's my x-axis, 10, and here's my y-axis, 5, and I can plot the point there, 10 and 5. And here I can plot the point 20 and 4, right? Because this is x, this is y. And I can continue on. I can plot each of these points, and when I connect the dots, I get a curve. We call this the demand curve. This represents the collection of points that would be combinations of price and quantity that the market demands. Now, in order to understand where we get market demand, we have to understand that it's a combination of individual demand from the number of individuals that participate in the market. So this is just an example that for one individual, you'd have a demand curve for that individual, and then we add that to the next individual and all the other individuals combined, and ultimately we end up with a market demand curve. Changing demand then is when we drop that ceteris paribus assumption. Then we're no longer looking at movement along the demand curve, which takes place when we have a price change. But now, if something that is an underlying market condition, so this is something outside of the price and quantity relationship. Now this is an outside factor. So when that happens, when there's a change in one of those underlying market factors or market conditions, then the entire demand curve shifts. So a shift will mean that at the same prices, there's no change in price. when there's a shift in demand. A shift means that at the same prices, you have greater quantity demanded at each price along that curve. And so it's going to represent a shift in the entire curve, and I'll show you what that looks like. But it's important to be able to distinguish between a change in price, which is a change in quantity demanded, or a change in demand, which is a change of the entire curve. So changes in price don't shift the curve. This is an important thing to remember. So here's our change in demand. Again, I'm going to go back and remind you that a change in price, so for example, if the price went from $4 to $3, you'd have simply a change in quantity. If we went from 4 to 3, all you'd see different is quantity of 20 demanded versus a quantity demanded of 30. However, when we have something that is an underlying market condition change, then we're going to see something different. So let's assume that we found out through a study that cereal makes you smarter. And as cereal makes you smarter, people are going to want cereal, more cereal, at every price, and it has nothing to do with the price. And so we're going to see a shift of the entire curve. So here's our increase in demand, and here's what it looks like. At every price that cereal was offered at previously, now people want to buy more. So we would call this an increase in demand. And that whole curve, when we plot that new information, shifts to the right. So now we have an increased demand curve. It's moved to the right. And when I say to the right, I mean to the right along this horizontal axis. That's an important thing to remember. So the prices didn't change. However, at every price along that demand curve, people want more. So you have an increase in demand represented by a shift to the right of that demand curve. What if cereal, instead of making you smarter, caused baldness? We can see that we're also going to have a change in demand. This is, again, a change in underlying market conditions. And so if cereal causes baldness, we can assume that people are going to want to buy less at every price that cereal is offered at. And so we'll just put that information in here. Note that the prices haven't changed. However, at every price along that curve, the quantity demanded is less. And so that line, when we plot that new information, shows that it has shifted to the left, moved to the left along this horizontal axis. And so a decrease in demand is a movement of that demand curve inward, and by inward I mean closer to the zero, close to the zero. There are 5 determinants which are shifters of demand, 5 things that will cause that demand curve to shift, 5 general categories of things. And you should be familiar with these. If you took micro, they should be pretty much in your brain still. However, if you're just seeing this for the first time, you'll want to know that there are things that will shift those demand curves and the supply curves as well when we get to that. And this will come up again in macro, because when we're looking at aggregate demand, it moves in the same ways as demand. So it's an important thing to understand. You can see the 5 shifters here. We'll talk about each one individually. It's important to know that a change in price, I've said this before, I want you to remember this, a change in price does not shift the curve. It only causes movement along the curve. But we're talking about the things that will shift the entire curve, to the right for an increase, to the left for a decrease. Now, I think some of them are pretty self-explanatory. For example, tastes and preferences. I think you can understand that a change in taste and preference will either increase demand or decrease demand depending on how people view something. And this is what all advertising is intended to do, which is shift your tastes and preferences for something, allegedly, to increase your preference for something is the purpose of advertising. Number of consumers, again, something I think it's easy to understand. If the number of people in the market for a particular good increases, then you're going to have increased demand. And if you have fewer consumers in a market for a good, then you're going to have less demand. Price of related goods is something that is specific. We're talking about 2 types of related goods. The first type is substitutes. Substitutes are used in place of something else. And not all goods have a perfect substitute, but a lot of goods have adequate substitutes. Think about things that you buy, and if the price went up, you might substitute with something else that you find suitable. Maybe not perfect, but a pretty good substitute. So if the price of a substitute increases, the demand for the other one will decrease. So I, again, go back to the use of Pepsi and Coke as two substitutes. And maybe you don't consider them perfect substitutes, but I think a lot of people see them as adequate substitutes. So if the price of Pepsi falls, then demand for Coke will go in the same direction. And so demand for Coke will go down because people, instead of buying Coke, will be buying the less expensive Pepsi because they see them as substitutes. And substitutes move in the same direction. We could also say if the price of Pepsi rises, demand for Coke will rise because, again, people are substituting the less expensive product for it. So keep that in mind. Substitutes move in the same direction. Complements are the other type of related goods. They are two goods bought and used together. And if the price of one increases because they're a package deal, it's going to lower demand for the other one. And so if we use skis and ski boots as our example, the price of skis falls, and since skis and ski boots are a package deal, you buy them both at the same time, then demand for ski boots will increase because now the whole package is cheaper. And we could reverse that and say if the price of skis rises, demand for ski boots will fall because the whole package is more expensive. Income also has two different parts to it. A change in income changes demand, but it really does depend on the type of good. So you have normal goods, which are goods that have an increase in demand as income increases, and a decrease in demand as income falls. So these would be luxury cars and seafood and jewelry and homes, all of the things that you would buy more of if you had more money and buy less of if you have less money. So I think that's kind of an easy one to understand. Inferior goods, we also understand these pretty well, but it might not be so obvious right off the bat. An inferior good is one as income increases, demand falls, and as income falls, demand increases. So think of all the things, and you may be in this point right now, as a starving college student, you think to yourself, boy, when I make some money, I am never going to buy this again. Those would be inferior goods. So perhaps ramen or non-brand cereals or, cheap fast food, all of those things, or perhaps the cheapest of toilet papers. All of those would be inferior goods. And as your income increases, the demand for those goods will fall. And at the same time, we could see it the other direction. We could say as your income falls, you might be more likely to buy these inferior goods. On the supply side, we see a lot of the same basic concepts in graphing. So let's start by defining supply. Supply is the quantities of goods that a seller is willing and able to sell, similar to demand. Willing and able are the key words here. They must have both willingness and ability to bring them to market. The law of supply is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And mathematically, we'd call this a positive relationship because they move in the same direction. So a positive times a positive is a positive, a negative times a negative is a positive, and so they move in the same direction. Whether they're increasing or decreasing, they go in the same direction. And the direct relationship tells us that as price increases, the quantity producers makes increases, and as price falls, the quantity producers make falls. And this is that direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And the reason for this direct relationship is because at higher prices, profit-seeking firms have an incentive to produce more. And if you were producing a product and the price for that product in the marketplace went up, you would happily bring more of that product to market. So it incentivizes it. So the supply curve is essentially a series of incentives for firms. When we graph supply, we put the x and the y-axis in the same places as before. Price goes on the y-axis, quantity goes on the x-axis, and we simply graph those points. You can see here in what we call the supply schedule, the relationship between price and quantity is direct. As the price goes down, the quantity supplied decreases as well. As the price goes up, the quantity supplied increases. When we plot those curves, we've got 10 and 1. That's our x, and our y, 10 and 1. So we can plot those points, connect the dots, and we have a line with a positive slope. And that positive slope goes back to that positive relationship between price and quantity. They're both going in the same direction. Now we can also look at the underlying market conditions that might change when it comes to supply. So let's say that in the market for cereal, new companies start to make cereal. If those new companies start making cereal, that has nothing to do with the current price of cereal. It's an underlying market condition change. Therefore, we would see that at every price in the market for cereal, more would be supplied. So price would not change, but the quantity supplied at each price would change. So we would see a shift if we plot that new information. That supply curve moves to the right, and we see a shift in the supply curve. And in this case, we'd call this an increase in supply. And we can see that it moved along this horizontal axis to the right. So prices did not change. Underlying market condition changed. That leads to an increase in supply. We could say that instead of a positive change, we could look at a negative change. And we could say, what if a drought destroys corn and wheat crops? And this would be obviously a negative change. And again, it wouldn't change price. It would change the quantity supplied at each price. And so here we have the prices remaining the same. However, at each price in the market, there's simply less ability to produce because you don't have the inputs that you need. And so the quantity supplied decreases. If we were to graph that new information, we'd see that that curve shifted to the left, showing a decrease in supply. So a movement to the right is an increase, a movement to the left is a decrease, no matter what. If we're talking about demand or supply, it does not change. Right is an increase, left is a decrease. The shifters of supply, much like the shifters of demand, are underlying market conditions, changes in the underlying market conditions, not changes in price. A change in price of the good in the market will only change quantity. However, these are things that will shift that supply curve. So we have the price of inputs. That's not the same as the price of the good in the market. An input is a resource that goes into producing a product. So if there's a change in the price or availability of inputs, then that's going to shift the supply curve. The number of sellers, how many sellers are in the marketplace, that will influence how much is being supplied at each price. Changes in technology will affect how much can be produced at each price. Again, these are not changes in price. These are underlying market conditions. Changes in government action can shift that supply curve. Taxes and subsidies are both government actions. A tax will take away from producers. A subsidy is a payment that the government makes to producers for lots of different reasons. The opportunity cost of alternative production can shift that supply curve. Expectations of future profit, depending on what they are, can shift the supply curve to the right for an increase, to the left for a decrease. And it's important to keep in mind, just like with demand, that changes in price don't shift the curve. They only cause a movement along the curve. When we put supply and demand together, we can see graphically where equilibrium price and quantity can be found. In the math review for this course, you were asked to identify equilibrium mathematically and graphically. And for the most part, we'll really be using graphical representations to understand equilibrium. So in this case, you can see very quickly where equilibrium is because it's where supply and demand come together. And so if we look at the demand schedule and the supply schedule, we can see that they coincide at $3 as the equilibrium price and 30 units as the equilibrium quantity. So if we plot those curves and we can see where they come together, we get a good picture of the concept of equilibrium. Equilibrium is a really important concept in economics because we use it as a reference point for a lot of things that deviate from the equilibrium. If the price increases to $4, for example, here's what happens. We are suddenly out of equilibrium. We're at a point of disequilibrium. At $3, everything was great. We had supply and demand matched up. We had what we call a market clearing price. $3 would be a market clearing price because there's nothing left over. You can sell all you want at that price. You can purchase all you want at that price. However, when the price goes to $4, we have a condition of disequilibrium that's called a surplus. And the surplus exists because the quantity demanded is here. At that higher price, quantity demanded decreases from this original price. And you have a quantity supplied that is higher than it was at equilibrium, because that $4 is higher than $3, and that incentivizes producers. So producers are incentivized at that higher price, buyers are discouraged at that higher price, and so you have this disequilibrium that's a surplus. And the surplus means that no longer do we have a market clearing price, we have an excess supply problem. There's too much of it, the product. And so we can measure the surplus here. We can say at $4, we can see that there's a surplus of 20 units, the difference between 40 units supplied and 20 units demanded. The surplus at a price of $5 could also be calculated. You can see that pretty easily here. We can again just look at the quantity demanded versus the quantity supplied and subtract the two and get a quantity of 40 here. It's important to understand what a surplus is and how it can be corrected. In the market system, a surplus is usually resolved with no action on the part of any outside authority, as you have the surplus that must be cleared. And what happens at this point is sellers will start to compete, and that competition among sellers pushes prices down. That price will come down to equilibrium eventually. So let's look at the other problem that you might have. And this is called a shortage. We have a price now that's below the equilibrium price of $3. At $2, we have discouraged sellers, right, because that lower price does not incentivize them to take their product out to the market. However, buyers are pretty happy about that lower price, and so they would like to buy 50 units of it. However, sellers only want to sell 20 units of it, and we have a shortage, and the shortage can be seen pretty clearly as 30 units. We also call a shortage excess demand, and basically we're saying that demand right here exceeds supply here. We can also see how the market finds equilibrium on its own. It's an automatic process. Nobody has to be called in to fix it. When we have a shortage or a surplus in a free market system, producers will compete to lower prices if it's a surplus up here. And when it's a shortage, producers raise prices, but really they're raising them in response to competition among buyers. Whenever there's a shortage of something, people will compete to get the more scarce resource or more scarce good, and they will bid the price up. So producers raise prices, but not just because they want to, they raise them in response to increased competition by buyers. Here's an opportunity for you to practice with the concept of equilibrium. For the information here that you see, you should be able to identify the shortage or surplus quantity for each price. So go to each price given. So at $50, you can see you've got quantity demanded of 52, quantity supplied of 73. And for each price, go down the list and see if you can identify shortage or surplus quantity, how much the shortage or surplus is at each price. And let me just make one quick correction here for you, and that is that this price right here should be 20, not 30. So go ahead and take some time and work through this and make sure that this is a comfortable concept for you. Shifting supply and demand is a process that you should be comfortable with. The idea that given underlying changes in the marketplace, you're going to have shifts in supply and demand, and perhaps both at the same time. So one way to understand the process of analyzing changes in supply and demand is to begin before the change with a picture of a market with supply and demand and equilibrium identified, and then identify the change itself, understand whether it affects supply or demand, which determinant, those things that we looked at as shifters, which one of those caused the shift, draw that increase or decrease, and after the change, identify the new equilibrium price and quantity. So some practice for you here. And this is really one of those skills that for economics is essential to understand and be comfortable with. So here's some practice for you, and I would encourage you to just get a sheet of paper and practice these shifts. Make sure that you understand this process. You will see this again in macroeconomics because we'll be dealing with aggregated supply and aggregated demand. And therefore, you're going to want to understand how these curves move because they look very similar and they work in very similar ways. It's just simply the same concepts, but it's all of the products instead of individual markets. So here's the market for hamburgers. And before the change, you should be able to draw the graph. And then you will identify the change, draw the change in, and indicate the price and quantity after. So let me go through the first one with you and just kind of show you what I mean. So for the first one, if we're talking about the market for hamburgers and the price of sushi, and we're assuming it's a substitute, increases, here's what we're looking at. The price of sushi is increasing. So if we draw this, then we'll start with a picture of the market for hamburgers. We'll just keep it really simple here. There's our demand curve. There's our supply curve. We can label everything. And we can just kind of identify our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Normally I would do a dotted line, but it doesn't want to work on this. And so if the price of sushi, and sushi is a substitute for demand, if we go back to our shifters and we say, well, if the price of a substitute increases, and in this case, the price of sushi is increased, then what happens to demand for hamburgers? Well, sushi is more expensive. And if I have a choice between more expensive sushi and the less expensive hamburger, I'm going to go with the less expensive hamburger if I assume that they're adequate substitutes. So my new demand for hamburgers is going to be an increased demand. So I just labeled them 1 and 2 so I can see the shift. It might help you to just kind of visualize the shift by understanding that it's shifting to the right for an increase in demand. And I'm just going to label my original price and quantity so I can see what's different now. And let's see if I can change the color. And now I've got a new price and quantity because now they come together here. And so here's my new price for hamburgers. This is still the market for hamburgers. And here's my new quantity for hamburgers. And I made a little mistake there. That should be 1. And so you can see the shift and the resulting changes in price and quantity. And this is a very rudimentary drawing. It's nothing really fancy or even very mathematical. It has mathematical roots to it, and all of the lines, are based on mathematical understanding. But as you can see, all we want to do is be able to use the model to understand how these changes affect the market for a particular good. So in this case, that demand curve is shifted to the right, and the price has increased, and the quantity has increased in the market for hamburgers. And as you go through those practice problems, you can go through and do the same thing with the other changes. So hopefully you'll do that. There is a concept, and this is found in your homework as well for this week, of double shifts, meaning that both supply and demand change at the same time. You have a simultaneous change. And so an easy rule of thumb here is that if 2 curves shift at the same time, either price or quantity will be indeterminate depending on the degree of the shift. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let me go back and give you a blank page, and let me show you what I mean. So let's say I have an increase in supply. So here's my supply curve. An increase is a shift to the right, 1 and 2. And I have an increase in demand. Let me change the color. And here's my demand curve 1, and I have an increase in demand. So let's say here's my new demand curve. Here's what I'm trying to explain, is that here's my original price and quantity intercept. Now I've got a new price and quantity. As you can see, price hasn't changed. However, quantity has definitely changed. The reason we would say that price in this case is indeterminate is because it depends on the degree of the shift. If I made that shift in supply much larger, let's say this was my supply 2 instead, then my price would have come down. However, if I made my shift in supply much smaller, this is my S2, then my price would have been here and it would have been higher. So I hope that makes sense to you. You can see that depending on the degree of the shift, price could have been either increased or decreased. However, quantity does not matter how much the degree of the shift was. Quantity was going to be an increase regardless of how much I shifted it. So here's my to quantity changes. You can see that quantity would have increased no matter what. However, price would have either increased or decreased, depending on the degree of the shift. So keep that in mind. When you see this thing about double shifts, it means that one of the two, either price or quantity, will have a change that is indeterminate, and meaning that it's determined by the degree of the shift. Before we go to the last concept in this, you need to understand the concept of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is defined as the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. And so it's more of a psychic benefit. It's not really something that we measure as consumers, but we know it when we see it. So if we go into the store and we're willing to pay $50 for something and we find it on sale for $30, we recognize instantly that we are experiencing consumer surplus of $20. It's not necessarily something we write down or report to our accountant, but it is a very real benefit to us. Producer surplus is a little easier to see because it's the difference between the price they would have sold it at and how much they actually received. So the lowest, their minimum, the difference between their minimum and the actual price. So you can see definitions here. Consumer surplus is the buyer's maximum minus the price. The producer surplus is the price minus the seller's minimum. Graphically, you can see the area of consumer surplus here. And this is, again, a market, just a good old-fashioned competitive market, demand and supply. And consumer surplus is this area that's above the price, but less than the price that buyers are willing to pay. So all of that area would represent each individual buyer's consumer surplus, just aggregated here. And then the producer surplus is the difference between the price actually sold, the goods sold for in the market, down to what the producer would have been willing to accept. And we assume that the supply curve is also their cost. And so the producer surplus really is also profit. But either way, we can identify the area of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and this is the area of the triangle. I know you did that in your math review, so hopefully this is pretty easy stuff for you. And we can calculate the amount of consumer and producer surplus. The total of the two is the total surplus. So when we understand that, then we can look at this thing called price controls. And again, this is a review for most of you, so hopefully you remember about the distortions in markets that come when governments involve themselves. But if not, if this is not a review, then this is an important thing to understand. A price ceiling is a type of price control imposed by government in the market. And it's defined as the maximum legal price the seller can charge for a product. And it's a law that the government makes. It's not a suggestion. It's not a, we hope you sell at this price. It is, if you don't sell it at this price or lower, then the government will actually come after you. You will have committed a crime. So it's important to understand that we're not just talking about suggestions or limits that are kind of fluffy. This is an actual government-imposed law. The goal, of course, of such a law is to benefit consumers by making the prices of things lower and to keep the price from reaching equilibrium. So if in the price in the market for gasoline, the government might look at $3 a gallon and say, well, that's too high. We don't want our consumers to have to pay that much. Therefore, we're going to set a price control, which places a ceiling, or a cap. It's also called a price cap. We're going to put a ceiling on the price of gasoline that keeps it below equilibrium. And this ceiling will never allow the price to rise any further than that, so it will never get up to equilibrium. It's an important thing to understand because we just talked about this not too long ago, that when we have this condition of disequilibrium, when this price is imposed on the market, normally what would happen is that price would rise back up to equilibrium as buyers started to compete, because buyers will start to outbid each other to get the scarce goods. However, in the case where the government makes it the law, that is not an option. It becomes illegal to bid that price back up. And so what you end up with is not just a shortage, but a permanent shortage, one that cannot be corrected by market forces and competition in the markets. And so the question over here that says, does this policy help consumers? Well, yes and no. If you're one of the lucky consumers that's able to purchase it at that low price, then yes, it helps you. However, in general, it results in these shortages that are permanent. And one of the results of these shortages can be black markets. And people are very quick to find ways of getting what they want. And I bet you can talk to lots of people that experienced gas shortages in the 70s and some of the creative ways that people got around these price controls. My dad was telling a story at dinner just the other day, actually, that during the gas shortages, you couldn't buy gas at the controlled price, but you could buy gas and a $40 windshield wiper. And so these black markets or ways of getting around the law would pop up as people got creative. So this is a price ceiling, and price ceilings distort market outcomes because a market left alone would rise back up to equilibrium through the unfettered forces of competition. However, in this case, the government is changing the market outcome. They're distorting the market. And just to be clear, a price ceiling has to be below equilibrium to have an effect. A price ceiling set above equilibrium would have no effect because all it says is that it can't go higher than the price maximum. And if it's set above equilibrium, well, equilibrium price is going to be where the good is allocated, and so you're not going to have a problem with a $4 maximum. However, an effective price ceiling, when it has an effect in the market, is going to be set below equilibrium, just to be clear on that. A price floor is another type of price control. This is a price minimum. So this is a minimum legal price the seller can sell at a product for. This is, again, a law made by the government. This one, however, is intended to benefit sellers. And so typically we see this with agricultural markets where the price of agricultural goods are supported by the government. They set a minimum price, and this is to help the sellers. So in this situation, you can see that the price floor is a higher price. It's above equilibrium. It's a minimum. And so this is intended to benefit sellers so that the price cannot drop below $4 in this case and go to that $3 equilibrium price, which the government looks at and says that is too low. We want to help the sellers out in this situation, and so we're going to set a higher price. And this price floor is something that will cause, again, we've seen this situation before, where that disequilibrium point creates a surplus. And this is no different. However, because that surplus cannot be cleared through competition, as sellers compete, they can lower the price. Remember, the government sets a law that says, nope, this is the minimum and you can't go below it or you're breaking the law. So the forces of competition can't lower that price to back down to equilibrium. So you have a surplus and you have a permanent surplus. It cannot be cured through the actions of unfettered markets. So again, does this help corn producers? Well, here's your problem, right? You've got decreased quantity demanded and increased supply. So you've got a surplus. So if you can sell your corn, then yes, you're one of the lucky few. However, if you're unable to sell your corn, then you have to have something else that helps you. Now, a lot of you probably already recognize that in the United States, quite often the government will step in because they made the law, and they don't want the farmers to go bankrupt because they can't sell their corn. So the government will often step in and purchase the excess corn or whatever good it happens to be. Now, a better example of a price floor market is the minimum wage. And that would be a price minimum, a price floor set in the labor market, and generally in the market for unskilled labor. And that is a price that is above equilibrium, and it is the government set minimum. And you cannot pay an employee less than that. So the employees in a market like that would be the sellers of their service, and the purchasers or the employers are a little bit disincentivized by that higher price, and so they demand less of the quantity of labor, whereas the employees, the workers, are happy to supply their labor at that higher price, and you have, again, disequilibrium. And it's against the law for somebody to go to the employer and say, hey, I'll work for less than the minimum wage. That's called working under the table. That's a black market. and that's against the law. So again, we have a permanent surplus, but when we're talking about employment, a surplus of workers is called unemployment. And so it's a very commonly understood economic concept that higher minimum wages actually cause and sustain unemployment. And not just unemployment, but unemployment among the least employable, which are those without marketable skills. So it challenges our market system. To have an effect, the price floor must be above equilibrium. So just like you saw with the price ceilings, you have to have a price floor that sits up here. Otherwise, if you set a price floor, a minimum, below equilibrium, it will have no effect because equilibrium will allocate the product. So price controls, you can see them as good or bad. It really depends on who you are in the market. But to analyze them from an efficiency point of view, it helps to understand what they do. So we go back to the concept of consumer and producer surplus, and we can see that in a market where supply and demand are working their magic, that consumer and producer surplus are maximized. If we put a price control in, just to show you graphically what this does, let's say we put in a price floor, and now the price is set above equilibrium. We have this surplus, and it's a permanent surplus. It can't be corrected with market forces because the government says that's against the law. And so what it does is it cuts into our consumer and producer surplus. And it lowers the amount of consumer surplus. It increases the amount of producer surplus. And remember, a price floor is intended to benefit the sellers. So it's going to increase the amount of producer surplus. It decreases the amount of consumer surplus, and this loss of consumer and producer surplus right here in this gray triangle is what we call deadweight loss, and it's a drag on the economy. It's essentially economic activity that just never happened because of the imposition of the price floor, and this is inefficient. So instead of attaching labels like good or bad to price controls, we tend to refer to them as inefficient. And I can show you another example where price controls are inefficient, and that's the imposition of a price ceiling. And in this case, remember, price ceilings are intended to benefit buyers or consumers. So consumer surplus increases, producer surplus decreases. Here's our price ceiling below equilibrium. And here's the area of producer and consumer surplus that are lost. And this is that deadweight loss, which is a drag on the economy. It's economic activity that does not happen because of this price ceiling, and we call that inefficient. All right, good luck with your assignments this week. Next week in Lesson 2, we'll move on to look at circular flow and economic systems.